Hey there, welcome to the show. My name is Nate Bagley. Today's show is the second show in a four-part series where we're covering the four horsemen of the marriage apocalypse. Now, just as a quick recap, the four horsemen of the apocalypse are the four behaviors that, if gone unchecked in your relationship, will absolutely destroy it from the inside out. It will wreak havoc on your relationship. And this comes from actual scientific research. So Dr. John Gottman is probably the most popular marriage researcher on the planet. And over the last several decades, he's been studying what makes marriages work and what makes them fall apart. And his research has shown that these four behaviors, when gone unchecked, are the leading causes to unhappiness, dissatisfaction, and ultimately divorce. So they're a good thing to know about, and they're a good thing to know how to deal with in your relationship. So last week, we talked about criticism and the dangers of criticism and why it can do so much damage in your relationship. And today we're going to talk about criticism's counterpart, criticism's companion, which is defensiveness. And I'm really excited to share all about defensiveness with you. So as I said just a moment ago, criticism and defensiveness almost always come hand in hand. If you have one partner who tends to be a little bit more critical, their partner is typically going to be a little bit more defensive. Those two behaviors kind of come together. It's very rare that you find one person who's critical and the other person who just accepts the criticism. So criticism and defensiveness typically come together. And I'd like to start today's show off by kind of defining what defensiveness is. So defensiveness is protecting yourself from a perceived attack. So this is an instinct. This is something that you typically don't get to choose. It's built into every single human being, this instinct of defensiveness. And it's there to protect you from perceived dangers. And those dangers can be physical dangers, like maybe somebody throws a ball at you and you have this instinctual mechanism in your brain, in your body from millions of years of DNA that makes you flinch. Maybe somebody comes at you to fight and you put up your dukes and you get ready to fight back. But defensiveness is all about protecting you from a perceived attack, whether that's running away or whether that's kind of putting up your dukes and getting ready for a fight. And that same type of defensiveness that exists in the physical world also exists in your brain. You know, human beings are tribal creatures. We depend on the herd. We depend on other people for our mental health. And the farther back you go, the more we relied on each other to survive physically as well. And so we really crave being accepted by the people who are in our tribe or in our families. And when we feel criticized, our DNA, our instincts kick in and say, hey, like, this relationship might be in jeopardy. There might be something fundamentally wrong with you that makes you get kicked out of the tribe. And so it's really easy for us to slip emotionally into defensiveness to try and protect ourselves or justify our behaviors. So let's talk a little bit more about what defensiveness is and why it's dangerous. So defensiveness is really dangerous because ultimately it shuts down good communication, it destroys goodwill between people, and it turns little problems into really big problems. If you think of the most recent time that you were defensive, I know typically for me, it's little things. Maybe I forgot to put away my laundry and my wife gets frustrated because it's been sitting out. Then I get really upset and I kind of make a mountain out of a molehill. Or I insinuate that my wife is not using the proper tone and I find flaws with her and it turns into this big argument. And typically a defensive person has a really hard time giving their partner the benefit of the doubt. So defensiveness can be really scary just because it erodes at the trust and the friendship and the communication in your relationship. So you don't want that to be prevalent in your relationship or your relationship won't last. Now, there are ultimately two types of defensiveness. The first type of defensiveness is the counterattack. So your partner comes at you and says, you didn't put away the laundry. And you go, oh yeah? Well, what about you? Let's go look at your laundry. Or last week you had twice as much laundry out. Or you want to talk about laundry? Let's go look at the kitchen. And this is kind of a one-up. It's a way of distracting from your own deficiencies, your own problems, the things that you do that are wrong, and putting the focus back on your partner's flaws. I mean, it works temporarily. You don't have to deal with your own issues, but it's not really beneficial for the relationship over the long term. So the counterattack is probably the most commonly thought of form of defensiveness, but there's one other form of defensiveness that's worth talking about because this is the more subtle form of defensiveness. It's called the innocent victim. That's what Dr. Gottman calls it. And the innocent victim is typically the person who's like, I guess it's just always my fault. I can never do anything right. I'm just defective. There's something wrong with me. I'm always the problem. And they kind of just lay on the ground and allow themselves to be completely steamrolled by some sort of criticism or critique of their character or their behavior. They don't have the spine and the backbone to stand up and like confront the issue at hand. They just kind of roll over, once again, distracting from the issue, making it less about maybe the circumstance at hand and more about they're inventing character flaws and personality defects about themselves. And it's just a really crappy way of dealing with a problem because it doesn't allow you to actually talk about the problem. It just makes your partner responsible for having to kind of prop you back up and make you feel good about yourself again. Or they just leave you there in a puddle of depression and mess. And oftentimes that leads to resentment, and that's not good. So those two forms of defensiveness, once again, are counterattack and innocent victim. Neither one of them is productive. So what do you do if you are dealing with defensiveness in your relationship, especially if you're a defensive person? Well, you got to start taking some responsibility. That is the solution. Taking responsibility is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Like, it's easy to say, but in the heat of the moment, when you're feeling emotionally flooded, when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling charged, when that instinct kicks in without you even thinking about it, and you put up your dukes or you lay down to get run over, it's hard to think in that moment, oh, I need to take some responsibility here. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips of what this looks like. So first, there's this really great book called Everything Isn't Terrible. Phenomenal book that's all about anxiety. And in the book, the author, Dr. Kathleen Smith, talks about how anxiety, which is that feeling of feeling overwhelmed and flooded, that is often like the emotion that we feel that leads us to feeling defensive, it operates like a smoke alarm in your house. Now, how often does your smoke alarm go off in your house and it's actually a dangerous house fire? I would venture to say, at least in my house, 99.9% of the time, when the smoke alarm goes off, there's not an imminent threat to my safety. It's typically because I cooked the bacon on too high of a temperature or I left the bread in the toaster for too long. Those are the reasons that the smoke alarm goes off. But the smoke alarm still serves a purpose. It's really important. But when the smoke alarm goes off in your home, the first thing that you should do is not scream running out the door saying fire, fire, fire. The first thing that you should do is assess your surroundings, take a deep breath and say, okay, what's the appropriate response here? Now, your anxiety in your body is a lot like a smoke alarm. It doesn't really have a filter that says this is a dire emergency, your life is in danger, and this is like a minor problem. It just kind of flips the switch and says, hey, this is anxiety. This is something to worry about. This is something to be concerned about. And it's up to you to take a deep breath and take a look around and say, hey, am I really in danger here? Am I really being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger? Am I really at risk of being cut off from the tribe, from my loved ones? Or is this something a little bit more minor? And the smoke alarm reaction, that beeping sound, I need to pull out the fan and maybe calm it down a little bit and turn it off and deal with the problem at hand. Like, take the skillet off of the stove instead of like running for the fire extinguisher or calling 911. So the first step in learning to take some responsibility is first taking some responsibility for your emotions. So in that moment when you feel anxious, when you feel the desire to be defensive, when you feel like you need to defend your point of view, or that innocent victim starts coming out, take a deep breath and think, okay, is this really an emergency? Does this really warrant this type of behavior? Even maybe before that, it would do you some good to take an account as to what is your tendency? What are the things that send you off into your defensive behaviors? And what times in the past have they not been warranted? Has your defensiveness maybe been over the top? And maybe you can go to your partner and take responsibility for that and say, hey, recently I realized that like when you've wanted to have conversations, I've acted as if you were declaring war when really you just wanted to have a normal conversation as a couple about an issue in our relationship. And I just got way too defensive. And I want to own that. That could go a really long way. So one, owning your past freakouts where you maybe were overly dramatic about your internal fire alarm. And then number two, learning to manage that smoke alarm and make sure that you're not overreacting in the future. The second part that kind of falls into line with this that makes it possible is you got to learn to self-soothe. So self-soothing, if you have a kid, I've got a little baby at my house who's 6 months old and she's learning to self-soothe right now. And self-soothing means, hey, when I'm feeling emotionally flooded, when I'm feeling overwhelmed, anxious, angry, upset, frustrated, I need to learn to calm myself down instead of relying on other people to calm me down. And whether that's, taking a deep breath is always a really great place to start. Typically when we're anxious, upset, angry, or sad, we're not breathing very much. So Take a deep breath, calm down, slow down. That's a great thing. Learn to ask questions and get curious about your partner's intentions. If you feel like they're coming at you from a space of criticism, or they're pointing out your flaws and imperfections and being mean, instead of just reacting, ask, get curious. Curiosity is a great self-soothing mechanism. Learning to take care of your emotional needs throughout the day, whether that's through exercise or meditation, journaling about past experiences when you've been really defensive will help you come to a better understanding of yourself and how your brain processes these situations. And that can be a really great way to help you equip yourself with the self-awareness that you need to soothe in the future. So self-soothing is a hugely valuable tool if you struggle with defensiveness. The next thing, this is kind of where the take responsibility point comes in. If you've learned to self-soothe, if you've learned to kind of assess your fire alarm and understand when things are a true emergency and when they're not, really where the rubber hits the road is when you're able to start looking for the little grains of truth in what your partner is saying. Sometimes those grains are going to be a lot bigger than little grains, but instead of getting defensive, just own the fact that maybe you're not perfect. Heaven forbid you're not perfect. None of us are. You didn't put your laundry away. You're right. I didn't. I'm sorry. Boom. Conflict resolved. I'll take care of it right now. You came home late from work. You're right. I apologize. That was really inconsiderate of me, and I'll do my best not to let that happen again in the future. You overdrew the bank account. You're right. I did. You don't need to give excuses. Just take a deep breath and say, you're right. I went over the budget this month. I'm really sorry. That was irresponsible of me and inconsiderate of how much time and energy you've put into getting our budget put together. I'm sorry. I'll try not to let it happen again. Man, just taking a little bit of responsibility, even if there's a good reason for why you did something, taking a little bit of responsibility will help de-escalate and diffuse the conversation. What elements of truth exist in what your partner is saying? And can you just own? You don't even have to own what's untrue. Just own the parts of it that are true. And that will go a really long way to improving the relationship, developing more trust, and helping the conversation go a little bit more smoothly. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, just like in the last show, what do I do if my partner is the one who's defensive? What if I'm not the one who's struggling being defensive? What if they are constantly defensive no matter what I bring up? Almost every conversation we have, they go into the defensiveness. What do I do then? And I've got a couple of tips for you there. So the first tip I have is to have a conversation about the conversation. So if your partner seems to be overly defensive, they get defensive a lot, maybe there's a specific topic or conversation that always makes them kind of defensive with you, a great thing to do is in a moment when you're not arguing, when you're on really good terms, I would recommend when you're out for a walk or going for a nice drive, have a conversation about how those conversations have gone in the past. And be really kind about it and come from a place of curiosity and say, hey, I notice when we talk about the budget that's really hard for you and you tend to get kind of defensive about that. Is there something that I do that makes you feel defensive, or is it just the topic itself? Is there like a tone of voice? Is it the timing? Is it my approach? Is there something that I'm doing to contribute to making you feel maybe like you're under attack when we bring this up? And you'd be surprised what kind of a productive conversation that you can have and how much you can learn about your partner by simply having a conversation about how past conversations have gone. And another thing that you can do in this conversation is say, hey, what are some things that I could do in the future to make it easier for you to stay present without getting defensive in these conversations? And that can be a really give you basically the tool set, the recipe that you need to engage with your partner in a more productive way down the road. Another thing that will be really useful is typically people get defensive when they feel, one, like they're attacked, or two, like what you're talking about are things that they cannot control. So something that I would recommend that you do when you're talking about things that might make your partner defensive is focus on what you want instead of what went wrong, what you didn't get in the past. If you show up and all you talk about is how your partner let you down, how they failed, how they didn't follow through, how they hurt you, their instincts are going to kick in and going to want to make them slip into that defensiveness. But if you focus more on what you want for the future, what a more ideal scenario would look like, that would be amazing. So instead of saying, hey, you didn't show up to pick up Bobby from soccer practice and he was stranded out there for 45 minutes, freaking out, wondering if anybody was going to come get him. And now he's like in hysterics in his room and you're a terrible parent. I can't believe that you're so unreliable. How could you do this? You let him down. You let me down. Like, that's obviously going to send your partner into defensiveness. But if you have the conversation along the lines of, hey, it seems like there was a mix up here. What can we do in the future to make sure that we avoid leaving Billy at soccer practice without a ride? Is there something that we can do with our planning every week to make sure that we're on the same page? Could it be one person's responsibility to always get Billy from soccer practice? Like, let's come up with a system that will work so we don't let this happen again. And if you're more results-oriented and more future-oriented, your partner's going to feel less attacked and more like a collaborator with you in finding a solution that will work, that will make you happy, which makes it a win for your partner, and will make it easier for them to be present in the conversation as well. So stay focused on the future and more of what you want instead of on the past and what went wrong. And then the last thing that I would say that will help these conversations go better is taking responsibility for your own hostile tone, bad timing, or aggressive body language. Most of the time when a partner gets defensive, it's because they are blindsided by something. Maybe they're not in the mindset to actually have a conversation about something, but since it's eating you up and it's driving you nuts, you just kind of like word vomit. You're like this emotional volcano and you're like, this is the thing that's really upsetting me right now. And they're not prepared for it. That's on you. That's not on them. If you come across with like a really hostile tone and you're really critical or condescending or contemptuous with the way that you're speaking to your partner, or your body language is really turned off and negative, your partner will sense that. And that can contribute to their defensiveness. And that's something that you can be responsible for. You are responsible for your words and how they come out of your mouth. You're responsible for your actions, your body language, how you approach the conversation. You're responsible for your choices when you choose to initiate that conversation. And so if those are things that you've done in the past negatively, that have negatively impacted the way that those conversations have gone and contributed to your partner slipping into defensiveness, own it. Own the fact that you kind of have an aggressive tone of voice. Own the fact that you don't have the best timing and that maybe the way that you brought that thing up last week that didn't go well, when you were talking about who didn't take out the garbage cans or who missed paying the electrical bill and you were really upset and your partner was in the middle of a work project or on a phone call with their mom and you just like stormed in and started dumping on them, that was on you. Like that was a bad move on your part. When you can start taking responsibility for, one, apologizing for the past times when you've done that, but number two, also making sure that you're planning so that those things don't happen again, it will have a huge impact on your partner's ability to not get defensive and stay very present and stay involved in the conversation. So, defensiveness is a huge problem. If left unchecked, it will totally wreck your relationship, which is why it's important to understand how it shows up and what you can do about it. If you want to learn more about defensiveness, you can check out John Gottman's book, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. And don't forget to tune in for parts 3 and 4 on the series of the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse right over here.